Why did they make April O'Neil black in the newest adaptations of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? A lot of people were upset about this change because April is historically a white woman and feel that it changes the character too much, making her unrecognizable as April O'Neil. However, I want to dive into why this change is not a big deal and is actively a good decision by examining the history of black characters in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. Obvious disclaimer that I am not black and therefore do not have the same authority on this subject as members of the community. I would recommend checking out Johnson on TikTok. He's made several videos related to this topic, and black voices are incredibly important when it comes to this subject. However, I still wanted to speak up on this topic because I have a significant following and presence in the TMNT community, and I wanted to use this platform to speak up about the importance of diversity, something that is especially important to me as a queer Latina. With that, let's examine the black characters that do exist in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise outside of the most recent interpretations of April O'Neil. If we start with the 1987 series, there are two recurring black characters during the show's run. The first is Bebop, a gang member that is mutated into a warthog in the second episode of the show and keeps that form for the remainder of the series. If anyone hadn't seen that one specific episode of the series, which is likely for an episodic show like the 1987 TMNT series, there's a good chance they would have no idea that Bebop is a black man. I mean, there was an action figure made in 1992 called Mutating Bebop, whose human form is a white man instead of his canon design from the show. That said, even if Bebop was recognizable as a black man throughout the series, his depiction as a bumbling idiot of a criminal isn't exactly great representation. The second prominent black character from the series is Carter Dawson, the Turtles' primary ally starting in season 9 of the series. Carter having this huge role in the story is pretty positive representation, and despite my dislike of the last few seasons of the 1987 series, Carter is a pretty enjoyable character overall. However, his incredibly late introduction to this universe means he is only present in 13 of the 193 episodes of the show. That's only 6.7% of the entire series, and he's only present in what I would argue are the weakest seasons in the entire Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. The fact that in a show with dozens of characters, the only prominent black characters are either unrecognizable as black or tacked onto the tail end of the series isn't great. This doesn't even acknowledge what the series did with Baxter Stockman, but I'll expand upon Stockman's role in the franchise later on in this video. Ninja Turtles. Everyone's favorite and most memorable Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation, doesn't have a lot of human characters. However, one of its minor characters is Splinter's chess buddy, Andre. Andre is a nice guy, but unfortunately is the butt of the joke a lot of the time, with the show only using his blindness to play into the slapstick style of humor this show utilizes. It paints him as stupid as a result of his disability, and the plot of The Guest, the episode he is most prominently featured in, centers around him accidentally stealing an invention of Dr. Queeze's by mistaking it for his cane. On top of this, the Turtles express frustration at the burden of Andre living with them and the way he sort of messes everything up. He doesn't feel like a person and instead serves as a plot point for the Turtles to play off of. Next, we get to the 2003 animated series, which I believe has the most recurring black allies of any TMNT iteration. The first of these characters is the Professor, a homeless friend of Donatello's that discusses his infamous theories with the Turtles. He only appears in a few episodes, but he and his other homeless friends serve as a means of showcasing the Turtles' allyship with those in poverty. It's kind of fascinating how the Turtles are all about living in the shadows and not being seen by humans, but are totally chill and friendly with this group of people. Similarly to Andre, the Professor is used as a means of progressing the plot of his primary episode, Garbage Man. However, unlike Andre, he isn't used as the butt of a joke and has a great relationship with the protagonists. Our second 2003 character is Silver Sentry, the main superhero of this universe who essentially serves as Mikey's role model. He's basically the Superman of TMNT 2003, a very generic, ideal superhero. Although Silver Sentry doesn't contribute much to the main narrative, he does appear in several episodes of the series, and the way Mikey idolizes him definitely serves as positive representation. It's kind of unfortunate how both the Professor and Silver Sentry aren't given proper names outside of these titles. However, in both cases, the titles serve as a sign of respect from the Turtles, kind of like calling a teacher Mr. Smith instead of John. Our third and final black ally from the 2003 series is Faraji from season 5. Faraji is one of the 4 human acolytes that train with the Turtles under the Ninja Tribunal and is the closest to Leonardo. Upon his assumed death, Leo carries Faraji's sword to honor him and returns the sword upon reuniting with with him. Although Faraji is introduced in the final episode of season 4, his primary role isn't until season 5, which unfortunately didn't air until after Fast Forward, so he's in a similar position to Carter from the 1987 series, where he's just sort of tacked on to the end of the series. Unlike Carter, however, Faraji isn't really a character that stands out in any significant way. The 4 human acolytes are given somewhat distinct personalities from one another and serve as friends for the turtles during their training with the Ninja Tribunal, but don't really contribute much otherwise. Faraji blends in with the other 4 acolytes and is a pretty forgettable character overall.
MC Mikey.
April actually isn't the first TMNT character to previously be depicted as white to later be portrayed as black in a subsequent iteration. Bern Thompson from the 1987 cartoon is a white man, however, he was reinterpreted as Bernadette Thompson, a black woman, for the 2014 live-action film. Unfortunately, Bernadette Thompson is another example of a black antagonist in this franchise. Thompson's role in the 1987 series is for the most part very antagonistic. He embodies the toxic male boss archetype that sees women as less capable. There are several episodes in which Thompson favors Vernon over April, even though Vernon's entire characterization is based around him being pathetic and not having a good work ethic, crumbling under the slightest bit of pressure. We are meant to feel upset for April in these moments and recognize that her treatment is unfair, with the underlying message that criticizes the boys club that exists at Channel 6. In the 2014 live-action film, Thompson is once again an antagonist that disregards April's story about the turtles and fires her for making things up. While on paper the dynamic is the same, the underlying message is entirely different. As a black woman, Thompson likely would have faced plenty of discrimination in the workplace and treatment similar to 1987 April. However, putting her in a position of power that lets her belittle her employees doesn't have the same believability and underlying messaging that exists in TMNT 87. I want to clarify immediately that I do not mean Thompson having a position of authority as a black woman is unbelievable or problematic in any way whatsoever. However, painting her as an antagonist is once again not great for black representation, and trying to replicate the same dynamic that exists in TMNT 87 does not work because she does not have the same cultural authority that a white man has. To be fair, April was bad at her job and everything she was saying made no sense. I would have fired her too. But as a viewer, we are meant to get mad at Thompson for belittling April when she was only being truthful, which once again paints a black character as the villain of the situation. Although my knowledge from the various comic runs is pretty limited, there are a few characters that I would like to touch on. The IDW comic run once again features Bebop, but his blackness is much more prominently featured in this run compared to the 1987 series. However, we are once again leaning into some harmful stereotypes, with him being depicted as an idiotic and incredibly violent criminal. Angel Bridge, the leader of the Purple Dragons, is another black character from the IDW run that is associated with gang activity. However, Angel is a protagonist and ally for the Turtles, wanting to transform the Purple Dragons from the way it was run under Hun's leadership into something that can help better her neighborhood. I honestly did not register that Angel was black until it was pointed out to me, but if you look at her dad, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Angel is one of my favorite characters from the IDW run because she has a pretty interesting arc despite being a side character. I love the way that she plays off of Harold and Alopex. She's just a really cool character overall. Another black ally from the IDW run is Carmen. Carmen is honestly a pretty forgettable character despite us being told that she's important, and she isn't introduced until issue 123 of the series. Sophie Campbell's run of the IDW continuity is pretty well understood to be the weakest of the IDW storylines, and for me the biggest reason for this is the sheer volume of characters that are introduced. This world had so many characters that already factored into the story, and all of the new characters added after issue 100 sort of all just blend together. If you asked me to describe Carmen, all I remember is she met Leo while she was boxing or something, and that she became one of Leo's students. I genuinely don't remember if she's done anything significant related to the plot, or if she's just another background character that's been added to this universe's cast. Either way, Carmen doesn't stand out. The final comic character I want to talk about is the kind of a shit show of a character known as Dreadmon. He originates from the Archie comics and was also featured in the IDW continuity. In both cases, he is a black male whose real name is unknown and is thus only referred to as Dreadmon, which is not great. Once again, we have a black character that is mutated and thus not depicted as human, and is exclusively referred to by a kind of problematic nickname. Archie Dreadmon was a teenage boy from Jamaica that gained super speed speed from a talisman he stole, which helped him become a more efficient thief. This talisman is eventually what transformed him into his mutant form. IDW Dreadmon was a child soldier from Congo who agreed to be part of Null Group's scientific testing that resulted in his mutation. In both cases, Dreadmon was a black child that was associated with crime and violence and lost his humanity as a result. Now, I think it's possible to shed light on some of the issues of war and violence that plague other countries. However, when the character that is most prominently featured from that region isn't depicted as human, and in IDW Dreadmon's case is treated sort of like a boogeyman, it's not a particularly great way to handle it. I mean, he's literally described as, quote, a feral beast walking on two legs, end quote. Dreadmon's humanity is diminished not just by his mutation, but the fact that he doesn't have a name outside of this title and his label as the Jersey Devil. The turtles themselves are pretty commonly interpreted as black. Of course, being born regular turtles, they wouldn't have a human racial identity. However, since the turtles are half human as a result of their mutation, it's not hard to imagine what they would be like if they were fully human, especially when examining the way they interact with certain aspects of human culture. In interviews with various creators involved in TMNT projects, they will often use terms like street or urban to describe what they were going for with the turtles, which are terms very commonly associated with black culture. I am by no means an expert on this subject, but I have heard several members of the community mention how the turtles are black coded, so if anyone has further insight into this coding, I would love to hear a more elaborate explanation than what I can provide with my limited knowledge. With this black coding and the turtles' association with Japanese culture through their practice of ninjutsu, it is very common that the turtles are interpreted as Blasian. In a somewhat recent crossover with the Power Rangers, the turtles were given human disguises in which they are portrayed as black teens. However, this crossover is the only time the turtles have been canonically portrayed as black in their human forms, as far as I'm aware. Due to the reincarnation plotline of the IDW continuity, the turtles have human designs from their previous lives in which they are Japanese boys. The 1987 series gives Michelangelo a canon human design in one episode that looks like this. I hate this design, it does not read as Michelangelo to me at all. And finally, we have these awful human designs from the TMNT short called Pizza Friday. Now, I obviously have my own personal bias of wanting to see the turtles portrayed as black and or Japanese, so I'm never going to like human designs that portray the turtles as white. However, even if they were portrayed as Blasian here, I cannot stand these designs. All of that is to say, while the turtles are heavily interpreted as people of color, something that aligns very well with the narrative of them being ostracized by society, it's very hard to categorize them as black representation. Similarly to the black human characters that are mutated, even if the turtles were canonically black or Asian, it's not something that is readily apparent. So while the turtles could be a good avenue for positive POC representation, because they spend the majority of their time as turtles and they aren't really portrayed as humans particularly often in this franchise, they wouldn't really work as solid representation for these racial minorities. The 2012 animated series also doesn't have particularly great black representation, as all three of its black characters are male, criminals, and end up being mutated. The first of these characters is Zever, who is only human for a handful of episodes before his mutation in episode 9. He and Bradford kind of fill the role of Bebop and Rocksteady in the first couple of seasons as Shredder's primary henchmen, but they are depicted as much more competent. I generally find Zever to be a fun character and I enjoy his personality, but as far as black representation goes, he spends the vast majority of the series as a walking, talking fish. And of course, he hits on April, a 16-year-old girl at one point, so not great there. Like I've mentioned multiple times before, Bebop is a black man that is mutated into a warthog. However, 2012's interpretation of Bebop is definitely a step up from previous interpretations. Of course, he is still depicted as a criminal, which isn't ideal, but we get to know him first as Anton Zek prior to his mutation, and he isn't treated like the same bumbling idiot as his characterization in other iterations. In the final episode of the series, he and Rocksteady also turn a new leaf and decide that they want to start doing good, which is the first and only time Bebop has been given a redemption arc in this franchise. I do really enjoy the way that Bebop is handled in 2012, but we can't ignore that he is once again put into the box of being a criminal that has his humanity taken away from him by becoming a mutant. Our third black character from the 2012 series is Baxter Stockman, and Stockman Stockman is a fascinating character when it comes to this discussion because prior to April O'Neil, he was the primary black character of this franchise. With that, it is time to talk about Baxter Stockman and his history in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Baxter Stockman! It's Baxter Stockman!
Stockman is one of the oldest characters in the franchise, as he was introduced in the second issue of the original comic back in October 1984. Disclaimer that I have not read beyond the first 7-ish issues of the Mirage continuity, so I'm not sure how Stockman's character evolves throughout this iteration. However, if I were to describe Stockman's characterization in issue 2 in just a few words, it would be a sociopathic terrorist. Baxter Stockman uses his mousers to rob banks and destroy the foundations underneath buildings. He demands various ransoms for buildings throughout the city, totaling $1 billion, including one of the Twin Towers, explaining that while the money is an added bonus, the primary reason for committing these crimes is, quote, because it's fun. Like I said, sociopathic terrorist. I don't think I need to explain why the first black character in this franchise being depicted like this isn't great, but what's fascinating is the way that he was adapted for the 1987 animated series. If we look at a lineup of various interpretations of Baxter Stockman from throughout the franchise, one of them sticks out like a sore thumb. Yes, while adapting the TMNT comic for the animated series, they made Baxter Stockman a white man. Now, because Stockman is portrayed as an awful, irredeemable human being in the comics, changing this terrorist of a character from a black man is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. However, Stockman's portrayal in the 1987 series is vastly different from the way he's portrayed in the comics. While Mirage Stockman is written as a selfish and unsympathetic terrorist, 1987 Stockman is a victim of the Shredder and only commits the crimes that he does under the Shredder's command. He's not a heartless monster and is instead a poor soul that found himself at the mercy of an evil conqueror. When the changes made to this character making him much more sympathetic are changes made alongside whitewashing, it leaves the message that Stockman's blackness is tied to him being evil, which is obviously very problematic. Now, if 1987 Stockman was portrayed as a black man, he still would not be particularly great representation because his primary characterization is that he's incredibly pathetic and incapable of standing up for himself. Either way, the way that Baxter Stockman is portrayed in the 80s and 90s doesn't bode particularly well, and unfortunately, it does not get much better. What I would argue is the definitive version of Baxter Stockman is Stockman from the 2003 animated series. Because the first few episodes of the series are based on issue 2 of the Mirage comic, Stockman's characterization is kind of similar to his original counterpart. However, they pulled back significantly on the sociopathic terrorist characterization. On top of this, 2003 Baxter Stockman undergoes a fascinating character arc, and the viewer is made sympathetic to his plight. Like with 1987 Stockman, he is a victim of the Shredder's ruling and is quite literally tortured as he loses parts of his body with each failure to complete a mission that the Shredder sets out for him. Unlike 1987 Stockman, the pain that 2003 Stockman endures is less of a reflection of his own patheticness and more of a reflection of the Shredder's evil. Baxter Stockman goes through a lot in the 2003 series, being reduced to only a brain, spinal cord, and single eyeball for the majority of the series. However, unlike the characters that have mutated, we do see Stockman's face as a part of his design regularly, usually as a projection over the top of whatever mech he is piloting. The biggest Baxter Stockman-centric episode from this series is Season 4, Episode 19, Insane in the Membrane. When it comes to racking up sympathy points for this man, this episode is a heavy hitter. Stockman tries to recreate his old body so he no longer has to exist as a disembodied brain, but his new body falls apart, leaving him as a walking corpse. Throughout this episode, we see flashbacks to Baxter's childhood and how his mother was very supportive of his incredible mind and knew he was destined for amazing things. One of these flashbacks reveals that she died while he was still a young boy, and this trauma has clearly stuck with Baxter into his adulthood. Stockman's hallucinations of his mother reflect his moral compass trying to redirect him from the evil he's committed, and he expresses regret for the things he has done. Insane in the Membrane explores Baxter Stockman's backstory and psyche to show that he isn't necessarily a bad person, just someone that's been through unfortunate circumstances. This makes him one of the most sympathetic antagonists in the series, especially when we reflect on the ways in which he was abused and controlled by the Shredder, Hun, and Agent Bishop. However, because of the intense body horror present in this episode, it wasn't allowed to air in the US with the rest of season 4 and was only available for US viewers when season 4 was released on DVD. So at the time of the season's original airing, a lot of what made Stockman a more sympathetic character wasn't present. Other versions of Baxter Stockman aren't as complex as 2003 Stockman and thus don't really contribute positively to Black representation. Like I mentioned previously, Baxter Stockman is one of the 3 Black characters present in the 2012 animated series. He's very similar to 1987 Stockman the way he's portrayed as pathetic and subservient to the Shredder. Baxter Stockman in the live-action film Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows is in a similar position, but has even less of a distinct personality and contribution to the film's plot, especially being bogged down by the 5 other antagonists present in the movie. In Batman vs. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Stockman is only portrayed in his mutant fly form, but his design still reads as a black man. However, he is once again boiled down to being pathetic and subservient to the Shredder. Baxter Stockboy from Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reads more as a joke character than anything else. He's just a greedy, money-hungry child influencer that wants to expose the Turtles to the public. Honestly, Stockboy feels more like a parody of Stockman from throughout the franchise, so he isn't a particularly substantial character. The most recent interpretation of Baxter Stockman from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem isn't an antagonist for once and is simply an outcast of a man that wanted to raise a family of mutants. However, he is killed in the opening minutes of the movie, so rest in peace, I guess. He was also originally intended to be Superfly, the primary antagonist of this film, so the alternative to him being immediately killed off isn't really an improvement. One of the only versions of Baxter Stockman that isn't portrayed as a pathetic failure is Stockman from the IDW comic continuity. He actually thrives in this universe, living his best life as the mayor of New York City. That said, his entire characterization centers around him being power-hungry and a corrupt politician, so he isn't exactly great representation either. When examining all of these interpretations of Baxter Stockman, it's pretty apparent that he's never been a great source of Black representation, whether that is due to him being pathetic, evil, or in Mutant Mayhem's case, dead. Stockman and Bebop are the most consistent Black characters to be reinterpreted for various versions of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and every single portrayal has at least one aspect that makes them not particularly great Black representation. And those reasons are in addition to them consistently being portrayed as antagonists. So, decades into this franchise, a change needed to be made for the better when it came to Black representation. And that change manifested itself in April O'Neil.
I was a witness, get me a reporter, call April O'Neil in on this case.
When it comes to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, there are a few characters that exist in nearly every iteration. Other than the 4 turtles, that typically includes Master Splinter, the Shredder, and April O'Neil. April is the primary human ally for the Turtles and usually adopts the role of the big sister of the group. She is a critical character to this franchise and is in the perfect position for positive Black representation. However, April O'Neil is not historically a Black character. Or is she? A common statement that I will see made is that April O'Neil was originally Black in the TMNT comics, and that is usually a statement associated with this image. As much as I would love for this to be true, it isn't. At least not fully. According to Kevin Eastman's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles autobiography, April was originally intended to be Asian and was named after a Black woman, April Fisher. However, in the final product, April reads primarily as a white woman. The curly hairstyle that April has for the majority of the series is not her natural hair. April is portrayed with straight hair for the first 3 issues of the comic, and the curly hair is a perm that she gets done in issue 4. In the official Color Classics recoloring of the original comics, April is portrayed as white with light brown or orange hair, most similar to her hair color in the 1987 animated series. That said, there are a few times throughout the Mirage run where April resembles a Black woman. This is especially apparent in issue 32, Egyptian Adventure, where she is very explicitly portrayed as Black. However, for the vast majority of the Mirage run, she more closely resembles a white woman. So, was the original April O'Neil Black? Yes and no, but the ambiguity of her race means that her portrayal as Black in modern TMNT has history that dates back to the original version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So when it comes to the complaint that April O'Neil was changed from being white, that was a change that was made decades ago. But let's say for the sake of discussion that April O'Neil was never portrayed as Black prior to 2018, and April from Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the first instance of a Black April O'Neil. What about this change is actually bad? In a franchise with incredibly limited Black representation, some of which that is actively harmful harmful, what is so wrong about taking a character that is already part of a consistently represented group of individuals and instead interpreting that character as part of a group that is underrepresented? Let's play a quick game. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to come up with and count as many white female protagonists from any piece of media that you can think of. 3, 2, 1, go. Time. Remember that number, either write it down or keep it stored in your brain. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing, but this time come up with as many black female protagonists that you can think of, again, from any piece of media, even the same piece of media, as long as they are black, female, and the protagonist. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Time. Now compare that number to the number of white women you counted. Chances are the second number is lower than the first, right? The point of this exercise is not to say that we need more black protagonists than white antagonists. That's not a point that I am trying to make. It is, however, meant to point out that white women have been and continue to be represented as heroes far more than black women. So by taking a character that is part of a group that already has plenty of positive representation and transforming them into someone that can represent a group that is not only underrepresented but actively discriminated against, nothing is lost from the first group and the second group benefits. Editing Tori here. I just wanted to pop in with a point that wasn't in the original script for this video, but I got dozens of comments of people saying, why can't we just create a new character for black representation? Why do we have to adapt an existing character? These comments were also often paired with the sentiment that changing an existing character makes that representation feel diminished, while creating an entirely new character allows for more creative freedom. I wanted to address this because it is a valid sentiment, but there are a few things to consider. If this was a young franchise with maybe 2 to 3 versions, it'd be much easier to create a new character that feels central to that franchise. However, when it comes to a 40-year-old franchise like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with over a dozen iterations, it already has its established characters that are central to the brand. Because of this, when people think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they think of the Turtles and Splinter and Shredder and April. Creating an entirely new character as positive representation is still very much a good thing, but that character is always going to feel supplementary to the other prominent characters in the franchise. If an entirely new character is created and added as a main character to a massive franchise like TMNT, there's going to be the question of why should I care about this person when I've been caring about these other characters for decades? Additionally, needing to create an entirely new character for the sake of representation means that the entire reason that character exists is to be black or Hispanic or Asian, whatever it may be. A few people also mentioned, why do people of color have to piggyback off of white characters to get their representation? And I agree, that sucks. But every single reinterpretation of a character is piggybacking off of its previous iterations. That's why this franchise and its characters are so beloved. When a lot of people, including myself, think of April O'Neil, they don't think of any one specific version, but the concept of April O'Neil as a character overall. By adapting an existing character, you don't have to spend as much time and energy focusing on trying to convince the audience to care about that character. You can instead focus on building up the elements of their personality and story that make them an even more compelling character without having to start with an entirely new character from scratch. Honestly, this grants even more creative freedom because you don't have to worry about convincing the audience to care about them. On top of this, simply adding a new black character as representation in TMNT means that the primary black character of the franchise is once again Baxter Stockman, who I've explained at length why he is not great representation. Now again, I am not black, but I am Latina, and I would much rather see an established character like Casey Jones portrayed as Hispanic as opposed to creating an entirely new character just to be Hispanic representation. I love Casey Jones, and being able to see a part of my identity reflected in him would be a sentiment that I imagine is similar to that of black fans when it comes to April O'Neil. I guarantee that most of these comments saying, wouldn't it be better to create a new character as representation, aren't Black and don't understand how representation helps us that are part of minority groups connect with these beloved characters even more. Of course, I would still be overjoyed to see a new character that can serve as this representation, but it takes a lot more work. Not just from a writing standpoint, but from a perspective of marketing and making sure the audience likes and connects with this character. When it comes to established characters in this franchise, it's much easier to make them a Black character that is beloved than trying to convince the audience to fall in love with an entirely new character. Editing Tori out. Some people will say that taking a historically white character and making them Black is just as bad as whitewashing a Black character, but that is not an apt comparison. This is because white people don't face the same hate, discrimination, microaggressions, the list goes on, as Black people do. But beyond the history of racism and inequality, when it comes to the actual representation that does exist, as we explored in the game we just played, this comparison makes even less sense. So taking positive representation of a Black person and switching it to yet another example of positive white representation is an actively harmful practice. To make a quick analogy, if you take a cup and fill it with water from the ocean doesn't suffer a huge loss by any means. If you then pour that cup of water into a bucket, there is a notable difference in how much water is in that bucket. Subsequently, if you were to pour out a cup's worth of water from the bucket into the ocean once again will feel practically no impact, but the bucket will. Trying to say that the ocean and the bucket are the same is foolish and intentionally ignorant. Losing April O'Neil as a white character has nowhere near the same impact as Black individuals gaining her as positive representation for their community. If, after all of this, from the exploration of the history of Black characters in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise to April O'Neil's depiction as a Black woman in the original comics, to hearing why more Black representation doesn't hurt anyone, you are still offended by April being depicted as a Black girl, I think you should take a moment to ask yourself why. What is so harmful about giving Black girls a character they can relate to and whose shoes they can imagine themselves in? What reason could you possibly come up with that doesn't say, either explicitly or implicitly, that you simply just don't like seeing Black characters in the media that you consume? In that case, the problem doesn't lie with Nickelodeon or the creators of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It lies with you. Please forgive me if I did forget any Black TMNT characters in this analysis. Because there are hundreds of episodes and comic issues, there's a good chance I may have missed some minor characters. This is especially the case for the comics since I've only read the IDW continuity, The Last Ronin, and a few issues of Mirage, so if there are any characters I missed that you would like to discuss, feel free to in the comments. That said, the fact that I had to rack my brain to come up with the Black characters that exist in this franchise says a lot about the historic lack of representation. I appreciate you watching and listening to this whole video. I was not originally planning for it to be as long as it was, but then I realized I had a lot of things that I wanted to talk about because the people that get upset about this piss me off to no end. Once again, as someone who is not Black, my authority on the subject is nowhere near as significant as theirs, so please go show any Black creators that have and continue to talk about this subject some love because they absolutely deserve the support. If you are a Black content creator and you want to contribute to this conversation, please stitch this video with your perspective, as your voices are so much more important than my own. Support and encourage diversity, listen to Black voices, and I will see y'all next time.